you all for being here. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to CCAG for sponsoring this and to RJ Julia for having us here. When I planned this book tour, it was kind of crazy. There was a lot of different places I could have gone, and you don't know really how to plan it geographically. And the two places that I decided to start was I was in Burlington, Vermont yesterday, and I'm here today. And when I went back and forth with my publisher, not to get them in trouble, but they were sort of like, well, you sure you want to go to, start out in Burlington and Connecticut? Don't you want to start out in New York or someplace bigger? And I said, I kind of want this book tour to have a spirit to it, right? And I want to have this book tour be reflective of what's actually in the book and what the book is all about. Not that New York or Washington is not in the book. But point being is that I wanted to start it here for a reason. And I wanted to start it with people last night, with people like Bernie Sanders, who's my old original. I wanted to start it with people like Ned, who was my most recent old boss. And I think it's important that we remember, and I think this is what the book does, or tries to do, we remember and see as a model the campaigns and the fights that were fought that have led the way to where we are at this moment. And what the book says is that we are really at a historic moment in our country. We are at a moment, I think we're on a precipice. And every election is billed as the most important election in the world, and that kind of gets to be a tiresome mantra. But if you actually look at where the public is on major issues, and then you go deeper below that, beyond the issues, and where is the public on how it feels about its government, how it feels about even its social institutions. And you see, you look at the actual data, we are facing a real crisis here. That the levels of anger at the federal government are at record levels. That the people's confidence in social institutions, including the government, is at a crisis low. And that if you compare what has happened when that's happened in our past to what could happen now, it should say to all of us that we are on the precipice of exponential, I think, exponential change. So what does that mean? Well, I'll do a little bit of the historical perspective. I think in the last 100 years we've had three what I would call uprising elections. 1932, 1964, and 1980. Each of these elections were rooted in a backlash or rooted in an uprising ferment. 1932, obviously, the Great Depression. You had the 1928 election went almost completely for Herbert Hoover. 1932 election goes almost completely for FDR. And you look at the map and you can see, if you chart the red to blue, it's incredible. It goes, all red and then all blue. 1960 election, very, very close. 1964 election, in the midst of the beginning of the anti-Vietnam War uprising, the civil rights uprising, civil rights movement, one of the biggest landslides for the Democrats ever. And then 1980, you had a situation, the post-Watergate era, where people were very, very angry. And I think that 1980 is the most analogous to where we stand today. That you can actually look at how the public felt then about Congress, about the government, and it's almost exactly the same levels of dissatisfaction. But it's more than that. The political landscape in the country was almost the same. You had a Middle East crisis. You had an energy crisis. You had a financial meltdown. You had a loss of confidence, again, in government. That was Watergate back then. Today we have the same things. It's not Watergate, it's Jack Abramoff. It's not that energy crisis, it's today's energy crisis. But we've lumped on top of it a food price crisis now, a housing crisis. And so what should be exciting, but what I think can be also a little bit scary, is to think about what came out of that uprising back in the late 1970s. In 1980, that uprising exploded into a full-fledged operational conservative movement through the 1980 election and through Ronald Reagan as a vehicle for that. And that had very, very real impacts on the country. Increase in militarization, military-industrial complex, massive tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, all policies that we're still dealing with today. So if we stand, I think, on the same at the same kind of place. And it could go, as the book says, that ferment could go into, I think, there's a possibility that it could go into a very dangerous direction. When I was at the border with the California Minutemen, and I was interviewing these people, you could see that their grievance, their activism is rooted in a lot of the same original core impulses that a lot of our activism is rooted in. These are people who, you have some racism there. You certainly have a lot of xenophobia, which I think is a little bit different. It's more of a fear of anybody else as opposed to hostility to one race. But the quote that comes out of that chapter in the book is, most of these people are saying, I just feel powerless. I just want to do something. It's an actual direct quote in that chapter. And so going to the border and defending the border, if you will, is something that makes those folks feel like they're doing something. And I think we all understand what that means. I mean, everybody who worked for Ned understands what that means. It was a way to do something, to take a stand. And I think that, if you consider that right-wing version of the uprising and where it could take our country, we could see a heavier racism. We've seen, I think, a pretty powerful amount of racism already in the Democratic primary. We could have more xenophobia. We had Tom Tancredo, they're fringe now, but it doesn't take a lot to move into the quote-unquote mainstream. We could have an expansion of the war in Iraq, a war with Iran, based on, again, the same impulse. The right-wing populist impulse right now is I think, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, very, very militaristic, particularly against the idea of against countries that are seen as a threat to us. But it could go in a progressive